Welcome to Mining the Mysteries, a catechetical podcast that explores the depths of our Orthodox and Catholic faith in the English tradition. I'm Matthew Stewart, Digital Media Director for the Anglican Province of America, along with your hosts, Father Wade Miller and Father Randall Russell from St. Philip's Anglican Church in Blacksburg, Virginia. We're glad to have you with us as we dig deeper into the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Welcome back, folks. Today we have a special episode. We are going to be having a discussion with Father Peter Joslyn from St. Alban's Pro-Cathedral in Oviedo, Florida. And we are going to be discussing godly men for the domestic church. Father Miller, go ahead and get us started.
Yes, it's great to have Father Peter with us. Thank you for joining us. This is great. We wanted to have you on for a while, and your name kept popping up, and finally I reached out, and so it's wonderful to have you with us, Father. So
it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I thought before we get into the topic, I thought maybe it'd be good for people to get a little bit of an idea, background of who you are and where you're from. And I know you're not a native Floridian, as a lot of Floridians are not. But anyways, I just wanted to see if you could just kind of help our listeners understand your context, your background, how you ended up in Florida before we jump into this topic.
Okay, so I grew up in South Central Virginia in Bedford County between the cities of Lynchburg and Roanoke. Graduated from high school in 2002 from a Christian classical school in Lynchburg called New Covenant. I matriculated to Wabash College, where I graduated in 2006 with a bachelor's degree with a concentration in ancient Greek literature. Afterwards, if you major in ancient Greek, you have two choices, really. You can go on and get a PhD and continue to teach academically, or you get a different job. And I got a different job. I went back to my old high school as an instructor and taught for 5 years in the middle and high schools at New Covenant, where I met my wife, Erin. She was a teacher there as well on the faculty. After 5 years, I got it into my head that I would try to go into the academy and teach on a collegiate level. But at that point, I decided to pursue patristics rather than straight up ancient Greek literature. So my thought was I'll go get a degree, a master's degree in theology from Covenant Seminary in St. Louis, where my wife's family was living. They had a good relationship with the historical theology department at St. Louis University. And so my hope was that I would then transfer or after the master's degree, go into SLU and get a degree in patristics. None of that ever panned out. What ended up happening was rather that I came to the conclusion that I needed to be in pastoral ministry instead. That's what happens when you hang out with a bunch of Presbyterian students who are training to be pastors. And I had come into the Anglican world through the Reformed Episcopal Church in my teenage years when my parents left the Presbyterian Church USA. And when I made up my mind to do pastoral ministry, I did want to do that as an Anglican and within the Anglican world. My parents at that point were attending St. John's Anglican Church in Greensboro, North Carolina, where Archdeacon Mark Manise is currently. And so that was the parish that I kind of came back home to join and went through the process of aspirancy and postulancy under Father Mark's supervision. Ended up transferring what credits I had from Covenant Seminary to the Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Bluebell, Pennsylvania, where I finished my theological education, graduating in 2017, the same year that I was made a deacon in the Anglican province. And from 2017 to the present, I've served a couple of curacies, first under Father Mark in Greensboro, then under Father Brad Cunningham in Fernandina Beach. That's how I first came to Florida, and helped Father Brad as a curate and administrator of the Christian classical school that he started there called Lindisfarne Hall. But in 2023, I accepted Father Ralph Waterhouse's invitation to come down and join the faculty of the Pro-Cathedral here in Oviedo, with the expectation that he would retire within the next 5 to 10 years, and that I would put myself forward as a possible successor to him in the rectorship of the Pro-Cathedral. He he retired a little earlier than we all thought. And so since this summer, I've been installed as the rector of the Pro-Cathedral here in Oviedo. And that's how I came to be here. And that's kind of who I am.
Wow. Yeah. And I know Father Ralph had been there as the rector for how many years?
I want to say between 15 and 17. I can't remember the exact time. He's been here for quite a number of years. And thankfully, he's coming out of retirement this next weekend when I go to Virginia to take over here and keep things running.
Oh, that's great. No, I know. And you were installed, what was the actual timing? Because it's not been that long ago.
No, it was, goodness gracious, it was the weekend of the Feast of the Assumption. It was in the octave of the Assumption. That's how I remember it at this point. So not long ago.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And you've, like many of us, you've traveled not only physically, but also just trying to find kind of a home and where to land. And we're thankful that you're in the Anglican province of America and that you're down in the Pro-Cathedral, which I know is a very dynamic parish, and that part of Orlando just continues to sprawl and grow. And so that's exciting. Yeah. So let's jump in here to this podcast on godly men for the domestic church and talk a little bit about this, because there's a lot of talk about the feminization of Western culture and masculinity and all these kind of questions. And I thought, it's one of those topics that you enter into with fear and trembling. But I thought it would be good because selfishly, Father Peter, we have young men coming from Tech, Virginia Tech, and we have young men coming, and this is a question that they're wrestling with, especially in our culture. And so when we talk about the feminization of Western culture, is this a kind of a valid issue, concern? And if so, why is it that it's manifesting itself in our culture at such a rapid rate, where it's almost as though masculinity is always dubbed with the idea of being toxic or something that should be looked at with skepticism? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and in the first place, we might recognize that culture as such always includes an element of feminization and of masculinization. Okay. If we think of culture, and this is the way that culture was thought of for many, many, many years before our own time, if we think of culture as the process whereby men and women produce other men and women, then of course there's going to be an element of feminization and an element of masculinization involved in that process. To quote Charles Dickens, that must be distinctly understood if anything wonderful is to come of the story that we are about to relate. Culture is the making of men and women by men and women. It's predicated on the fruitful conjunction of men and women coming together to produce children, and it's the fruit of that union, children, on which culture does its work. So when we're talking about feminization, what is meant? Okay, if that's an invalid concern, if feminization is, happening in the wrong way, if women are doing their work in culture in the wrong way, then I think we can talk about feminization as a problem. You're not going to get universal agreement on that with whomever you speak. In fact, the narrative of modern feminism, which is a different thing entirely, which we might have to talk about in the course of our discussion, is that no, women have been liberated now to fulfill a role in culture and in enculturating that they had heretofore been denied for some reason. And of course, the language of toxic masculinity, which you used, the other understanding is that men have for too long exercised a perverse and outsized role in the process of culture. Okay, that at least that's what's at play. I don't know if you have a response or a question to that, or if I should just kind of keep going.
Yeah, no, I think that's very good, and I'm glad you brought up kind of the feminist movement, which is not a monolithic movement necessarily. No. There's first, second, third wave feminism. Can you Can you explain or at least help our listeners understand what we mean by feminism as kind of a movement?
Ooh. And again, you're correct in saying that would be a really difficult thing to do, because there are many aspects to what we today call feminism. I guess I'm going to go about it by a shortcut, maybe. Sure. And it is always dangerous to speak in generalities. But when we're talking about the influence of, when we're talking about masculine and feminine influence within a culture, we are necessarily dealing with generalities, with large groups of people and ideas that are associated with what is a woman and what is a man. Serendipitously enough, just this very last week, you may have seen, are you familiar at all with the conservative commentator and author Helen Andrews?
A little bit, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Helen Andrews worked as a senior editor at the American Conservative for some time, and she's written a number of books. She wrote a book on the boomers in particular, which I enjoyed reading. The Generation That Promised Liberation and Delivered Catastrophe, I think was the subtitle. But she's written an article basically on the 16th of this month that she published in Compact magazine called The Great Feminization. And it's basically her argument, and I think it's a valid one, is that broadly speaking, men and women have brought different things to the table as far as culture. And I'm going to simplify it even further. There's that old joke that men enjoy watching a movie where thousands of people die very quickly, whereas women enjoy watching a movie where one person dies very slowly. Right? But it testifies to some kind of enduring differences between male and female psychology. And I'm not going to go off of the movie reference necessarily here, but men typically are the ones who say yes to conflict and to the use of force, coercion, and violence in a culture, whereas they say no to a great deal of a great many things, right? And usually they say no in service of the yes. That is, men say no, they prohibit things in culture in order to avoid having to use coercion, force, and violence. This is the way in which male power structures work. Force and violence are constrained by masculinity within a culture when the rules are understood by everyone and everyone knows this is what you do and you don't do. Whereas the feminine element of culture obviously and usually emphasizes cohesion and cooperation and tolerance, and they say yes to a lot of things, and the thing that they usually say no to is coercion, to force, to the use of violence. And so there's this dance between the masculine and the feminine element in any society, and it's obvious that the masculine element can go awry. You know, when you live in a culture that is, well, we might say toxically masculine, then it's repressive and violent at the same time. Lots of no's being said and lots of force and coercion being used, right? That's okay. I'm granting the possibility of a toxic masculinity. But the question that we're talking about here is it possible for there to be a toxic femininity as well? And I think that the very presence of the question, the fact that we're asking this question, indicates that something has gone awry in the way that feminine influence exercises itself in our culture. I don't know if that helps or clarifies.
No, it does. Stu sent me a video not too long ago, and it was from a woman who was given
It was Helen Andrews.
Yeah, it was.
There you go.
Yeah.
She's the woman of the moment right now.
Yeah, and she talks about how currently in law school, about 2/3 of the students in law schools are women. And she talks about this shift. And again, speaking as a woman, women usually are looking at things more in terms of empathy, more merciful, and how men, they look at things more strictly kind of by the letter and justice and the enforcement of justice. And she was talking about how the nature of law, we are going to see a shift, and already are seeing a shift, where instead of looking at cases and deciding them based upon this understanding of justice, now it's based upon this idea of empathy. And I thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
It's, in fact, I'm pretty sure that video that Stu sent to you, that Helen Andrews was simply condensing into essay form that she wrote earlier this week. It's the same thing. She talks about that, the preponderance of women now in educational and institutional spaces. They've climbed past into the majority in most of these things, certainly in the academy.
You see statistically way more women going into these careers, and the attainment of higher level degrees and leadership positions, not only in medicine and psychology, but also just in the corporate world. You don't necessarily need to have a 50-50 split between men and women on boards or in management positions, because if you're just aiming for a statistic split, you're missing the point.
Yeah, it gets kind of back to the whole quota thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Father Peter, just as we think about this in terms of the church, I mean, one of the things that we have seen, which is a good thing, by the way, is that, and when I say a good thing, I'm talking in terms of women stepping up. In churches, most of our churches are, the reason why things happen in the local parish is because women are not afraid to step up into roles in order to make things happen. I think about when I first came here to St. Philip's, if it were not for the women, there would have not been a parish at all. We would have closed. So this kind of plays into this. Why is it that women seem more locked into local churches? And how does this relate also to the absence of men as it relates to worship and maybe obstacles where men do not find the church a place where they can, get involved, or they want to get involved?
Right. And what you say about women in the parish and getting things done is absolutely true. The difficulty that we're going to face, I think, is that there is now manifesting itself, and this will continue to manifest, a kind of demographic hole in the church, and in particular in the churches that we might broadly describe as orthodox and faithful to the Christian tradition. We all of us, I think, those of us who are involved in pastoral ministry, have a cadre of parish ladies, church ladies who get things done and make things happen. But my experience is that Generation X, if we can, again, use generalities, that Gen X is a no-show. Okay, so there's very quickly going to develop a hole. Your church ladies are going to age out, and there simply won't be somebody, unless there's this revival of interest in Gen X, especially among women, to come back to the church. So I think that because of the modern atmosphere that feminism has created, I think the younger ladies now see that, well, they may be asking themselves, there's this other world now into which we can insert ourselves, in which it is we might call it the female-dominated world. It's the world of the professions, and if the church isn't going to be that, if it's not going to be female-dominated, but if the church is going to continue to try to exercise a healthy balance of feminization and masculinization within its own culture, we're going to find ourselves very rapidly in a place where men and women, especially young men and women, are going to have to step up into leadership roles within the parish. And that's kind of terra incognita. Of course, you're familiar with Leon Podles and his book, The Church Impotent. Mm-hmm. He basically chronicles the Western decline of masculinity within the Western Christian church. We're going to have to turn that around. So if the age of the church lady is over to a degree, well, it will never really be over because, honestly, organizations like the church do not survive unless there are women doing the things that they have always done. But we find ourselves, I think, in a challenging new place in which we're going to have to create opportunities and avenues for men to lead within the church in ways that perhaps years before they have not been involved.
Yeah. So, Father Peter, do you think that some of the absence of men or the failure of kind of stepping up and leading within the church, do you think that is just apathy by men, or is it more of it's a foreign place for them in terms of as men? Is it kind of a synthesis of both? Why do you think that men oftentimes, I'm not obviously stereotyping every man, but why is it that there is a vacuum when it comes to most local parishes and men in terms of leadership?
Well, I think it builds itself up in the same way that it has built itself up in parallel within other social institutions. When a space becomes female-dominated, men tend to withdraw. That's just the way that it goes. If the women are doing that thing and the men are not involved or seriously involved in its leadership, they will tend to withdraw. That's what happens, and that happened in the Western Church. But I'm witnessing the same thing in my parish that you've described with young guys coming from tech. That is, most of the young people now coming into my church are young men. That's what's happening. And largely because I think the young men in the wider culture are feeling alienated. They're looking for some space that takes them and their concerns seriously. And the church ought to take their concerns seriously, as it should take the concerns of young women seriously. It should be an all-encompassing thing. And they're looking for a place in which they can be, for lack of a better term, appropriately masculinized. Podles talks about this as well. Men find their identity as a man always within the company of other men, and usually within a hierarchy of other men. That's just what we've been doing. We're kind of conditioned to do that. So, and they're coming largely, we can see this all around us. These young men are coming to the traditional and orthodox expressions of Christianity. They're not joining the local evangelical free big box church in droves, largely because the worship of those sorts of churches can be a turnoff. And we have to realize that we're not automatically, simply by virtue of being in an Orthodox and traditional Christian tradition, we're not inured to the same sorts of things that could turn young men off, right? We can make our worship pretentious and stuffy. We can make it, for lack of a better term, overly feminine, right? We can celebrate the Mass like pansies. Okay, and that is a turnoff. So, and that's been done. That's been done in the Western Christian tradition for years. A kind of, our homilies that are short on things like duty and vocation and long on kind of limp-wristed tolerance. I'm not saying that Christians should not be living at peace with one another, but we have failed for many, many years in the West to appropriately masculinize our men, to teach them how to say no to the right things and how to say yes to the right things. So, if God's judgment and wrath never make an appearance at your church, if the divine no never shows up, you think about the Decalogue and how many no's are there, then we're not taking advantage of the inbuilt and, I would say, core Christian masculinity that is part of our tradition. If we shuffle all of that away in deference to the openness and the feminine element of the faith, which does exist and is valid, But if we're doing all one thing and not the other, then we're going to turn these men away, and they're not going to find what they're looking for as they're coming to us now at this moment, where they feel as if masculinity is devalued, or actually, it's been turned with that sort of language of toxic masculinity. Again, not denying that there is a possibility of toxic masculinity, but that language, they're not going to come to us unless we provide what they're looking for, which is structure, order, discipline. That's all I got to say about that.
Yeah, no, that's very good. And I think that whole understanding of order is so important, because as we see, and I've listened to, whether it's sociologists or talking people that are kind of have a pulse on the culture, this, like Jordan Peterson, I'm not saying that he's a prophet or anything like that, but I'm saying it's resonating with people, this idea that we see, chaos becoming something that's codified almost in our culture, and there's a healthy rebellion against that, and it's especially with a lot of these younger men who really do want order, because they come from homes that are broken, or they come from experiences where there is disarray, and they're looking for order. And I think in our tradition, I don't think it's any coincidence that within our tradition, as well as, say, Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a lot of conversions into that. Could you speak to that?
Oh, no. Men want to know what time it is and what the rules are.
Yeah.
Again, Helen Andrews was talking about this in her article, again, going back to her preference to live in a system in which, in particular, the legal system is defined by rules and not by empathy and emotion and things of that sort. Men thrive on the discipline that rule and order provide. We kind of need it in order to flourish. It contains and restrains our worst impulses and directs us in the way that we ought to be going. And especially traditional Orthodoxy, and it seems like Eastern Orthodoxy in particular is kind of having a moment in our culture today. It promises that, we're going to make you disciples of Christ, and disciples means sitting at the feet of the master and adopting certain ways of living, avoiding certain things and doing certain other things. This is it's the voice of the Father that these kids have not heard, either on a cultural level or in their own homes, because of the breakup and the breakdown of the American nuclear family, which you can think of as the primary cultural breakdown. If it's men and women making men and women, it kind of starts in the home. And a lot of these kids are coming from homes that were broken, for one reason or another. They want to be taught desperately how to be a father because daddy wasn't there, or vice versa. Many of the young women want to be taught how to be mothers because mom didn't do for them what they needed or expected. So there's, and the Orthodox tradition, because of its long-standing historical rootedness, these are the first places that they're going to look for answers. And in a sense, because in comparison to the wider culture, traditional Christianity is the lost cause that was not tried, to quote G.K. Chesterton. So people are willing now to give it another shot, but we have to rise to the occasion and prove that is in fact the case.
That's excellent. Yeah. So we kind of talked about the cultural analysis, which is important because that kind of lays the groundwork of where we're going. We're going to kind of switch now and talk practically, and that is not that there's a dichotomy between analysis and practicality, but feeding into the practicality, how is it that, how are men to lead, and what can men do to be godly leaders? I know it all begins with kind of this changing, this metanoia of self, but then how does that translate into homes, in parishes?
Right. Oof. Getting down to the brass tacks of things, I think that men need to learn to say no first. It's time to embrace the thou shalt not of Christianity. And largely that has to start with the self, first and foremost. Men need to learn to say no to the flesh, to their own desires. Without self-discipline, there's no order or larger discipline to be observed. So we need to start encouraging men to get their own houses in order. And not to be too blunt, but it starts, really it does start with the plague of lust that our young men are dealing with in particular. There's, really, I think you could simplify and boil all of the problems in modern society down to feminism and pornography. Okay? So the first battle that young men need to be taught to win is the battle over the self and to learn to say no. And I think that once you can learn to say no to the sinful desires of the flesh, then you have a place therefrom. You then have a place where you can learn to say no to other things, to say no to corrosive social practices, to sin wider. It's taking the beam out of your own eye before you start trying to remove specks from other people's eyes. And I think that if men would focus first on self-mastery, and if we would preach that to them, then what happens is the staff and the sword kind of materialize in your hands as a man to do the work of protecting and shepherding the people of God. Whether or not you're clergy or laity, you're going to have a role in that. If you're just as the priest or the monarch of your own home, you're going to have an opportunity to do that, but not until you practice self-discipline and mastery of the flesh and its desires. This is going to go on into our second episode, probably, when we talk about anxiety and things of that sort. But it boils down to an intentional practice of Christian ascesis, without which, these things don't just magically happen with vibes and feelings. That's, you have to do it.
Yeah.
So basically, as a man, we need to be communicating to our men, young and old. Start running the race as if you intend to win the imperishable crown, and the rest will follow. It really will. It will fall into place.
Yeah.
So.
I think that one of the gifts, and it's the bedrock of our tradition, is this whole understanding of kind of this Benedictine rule, which is the prayer book, which is morning and evening prayer. And one of the things we're seeing here, and I'm sure you're seeing it as St. Alban's as well, is private confession becoming something that's so integral to this idea of controlling the passions and saying no, as you perfectly said. And, the biggest, I would say, epidemic for young men is the porn issue.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's very helpful. And I think giving men a rule of life and, really encouraging this rule of life of morning and evening prayer and frequent confession and coming to the Eucharist in a way that is penitential, but also thanksgiving for the grace and the mercy that God desires to always pour out. I think that is so countercultural, and yet we have it in our prayer book tradition. So,
we do.
Yeah.
Again, it starts too with prayer.
Yeah.
Like you said, the rule of prayer. Dad at home should preside at the daily office in his house.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he does. He should. That conditions him both to follow a rule of prayer himself and then to discipline his own children in that. It's a huge thing.
Yeah.
And again, our tradition provides that.
Yeah.
In ways that are scalable to however many kids and whatever age they are. In my house, I've got 4 kids, the youngest of whom is 7.
Mm-hmm.
And, we use the family office at the back of the prayer book. It's very short, but everyone can participate. And it's a daily thing. So
it also says something about the vocation of the office of the priesthood, in terms of parish ministry. And that is, it's not just getting up there and saying Mass, although that's important, but it's also helping people cultivate that discipline of morning and evening prayer and really trying to emphasize, our life as a sacrament that is the continuation of what we receive in the Eucharist. And I think that is something that's connecting. Again, I'm not just talking about younger people, but especially younger men, because that's kind of the focus of this, that there's something very liberating, the law of perfect freedom, right? There's something very liberating in that rhythm, routine and discipline. Saying no also means saying yes in terms of incorporating that. So it's very good. So how does this topic of, we've been talking about especially men being leaders in their home, and you've already, I think, talked about this really well, but in a day in which marriage is being kind of, how do I say this? Guys are not getting married as young.
Right.
How does that play?
It takes two to tango.
Yeah. So how does that connect with this whole understanding of kind of godly men and developing in godly men? In other words, how does this relate to singles in our parish?
Right. Yeah.
I know it's a total loaded question.
Yeah, but before you can lead, you have to learn to be led. This we mentioned earlier, talking about the ways in which men are formed as men. They usually have to do it in a community of other men. And, you have to, our culture has hated dad for so long, right? And then we're disappointed that we can't be dad when we have rejected the concept of a superior authority, where we have not been content to live under authority. And young men need to learn to follow orders before they can start giving them. And they have to be ordered, their lives have to be ordered in such a way that they're in a sense that they make themselves worthy of that leadership, that position of leadership. And being a husband, marrying, is a position of leadership. Now, that's not to dismiss the very real and difficult pressures under which young men are operating in our culture today, especially with respect to marriage. It is increasingly difficult for a young man to economically better himself to the point where he feels comfortable in starting a marriage, and women sense that. Their economic opportunities don't necessarily make marriage an attractive proposition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the culture speaks to young women, oh, you don't need to get married now, you don't need to have children now, that you can have later at your pleasure. And in the meantime, enter the workforce, have your career, have it all, right? But men, celibate men and single men in our church, they're struggling in ways perhaps that previous generations didn't struggle, but they're going to have to find a way to practice and exercise godly leadership, perhaps in a celibate state or in a unmarried state. I can't, it's impossible to say for how long. I mean, I've counseled a number of young men who are deeply disappointed at their failure to enter into the state of marriage. And the bitterness and the disappointment only grow as the men themselves age. It's a difficult thing, and I don't have magic bullets for that, other than the fact that we know for sure that complaint, bitterness, and disappointment is not going to solve the problem. What you have to do is, in a sense, forge yourself into the kind of person that someone would want to marry, and then trust God that if that's going to be a possibility, it's going to happen. And in the meantime, find other ways, if necessary, to practice spiritual paternity and leadership. I don't know if that's kind of nebulous.
No, it's good. And one of the things I think with younger men too is having other men in the parish that are really trying to live out this rule come alongside younger men and help kind of mentor and shape. Because we think oftentimes that like social media is negative just on younger girls. that's true.
Oh, no. It is true. Yeah.
But young men are affected by this too. And so much of what they're mimicking or they think they should mimic is totally false. And I think, one of the things, and Stu's a part of this, I'm not actually, it's some of our laity here, men, and our women just started this too, where they pray the office and then they challenge each other with their rule of life. And it's a group of men that come together on Mondays. I know the women now are doing this on Thursdays. And I think it's really healthy. And I purposely am not in that because I want these men to be able to really have the opportunity to discuss. And, where I come in is one of the things they do for their rule is confession. But being able to hold each other accountable, talk about these issues, and then outside of Monday praying the office or whatever, meet with one another and really, it's that whole saying from Proverbs, as iron sharpens iron, helping each other in terms of accountability. And I think that's so crucial, especially in a culture where, we're so connected, but yet we're extremely disconnected from reality. Yeah.
And largely that, I think a lot that can be largely attributed to the disintegration of male-only spaces in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the church should obviously, as you're doing, provide some sort of male space for the guys in the church to get together, work through their rule, their common rule, their individual rules, and discuss the challenges that are peculiar to them and their interests. Because if we don't seize the moment, if we don't respond to the cry of the heart from men in our culture now, who are begging for order, for community, for structure, for direction, then they're going to find it in all the worst places. Like I said, social media is out there, and they're, you haven't seen toxic masculinity yet until you've gone into some of the corners of the internet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. May I ask, Father, not necessarily the ages of your kids, but boys, girls, how many do you have in terms of?
I have two of each, and the eldest is a freshman. So I have two boys and two girls.
Okay. I have two girls that graduated from high school not too long ago, so this is a topic they talk about.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How it's very difficult to find men that'll be men, meaning, give you an example. One of my daughters said there's this guy that liked her but never came up and talked to her and then would send things by text. And she's like, I don't want to communicate that way. If he doesn't have enough courage to come up and talk to me, I don't really want anything to do with this guy. And that leads into the kind of the final questions here, and I'll consolidate. But what should women be looking for in terms of men? And then that's question number one. And then the follow-up to that question is, how can women encourage men in leading and being men?
Right. Well, those are huge, broad questions. Now we're talking about the necessary work of feminization, healthy feminization in the culture, because women have a part to play in making men in the same way that men have a part to play in making women, et cetera. There's a dance that's going on here. So women need to intentionally help to form the sort of men that they want to be around. Okay. And there's a difficulty here, because this requires feminine wisdom and discipline. It doesn't just magically happen. I think that because of the narrative of feminism, we oftentimes run into this dead end of thinking of women as necessarily always as victims of systems, right? That they're always passive. But the fact of the matter is that I think that on a cultural level, women actually have a great part to play in the sorts of men that the culture produces, both in terms of nurture from the standpoint of motherhood, but also from the standpoint of desire. Like, what sort of male behavior is rewarded? What sort of men are sought after and respected generally, culturally. And it is not the case that without serious thought and discipline, women automatically prefer what the Christian would define as a good man, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with it's a pseudonym, but maybe his name is Anthony Daniels, the psychologist who wrote under the name of Theodore Dalrymple in England. Okay. He worked for the British NHS and he became kind of a cultural commentator in what he saw amongst what he described as the British underclass. And the fact of the matter is that there was a pandemic of bad female preference at work in what he described as the British underclass. That is, they would time and again prefer the attentions and the company of men who were violent, undisciplined, and liable to be unstable, right? And we, as a culture, women can make that decision. They can prefer the behaviors of men who are unstable, violent, lazy, not men in the traditional mold of Christian morality. So women have to make up their minds as Christian women, realizing that they have this undeniable part to play within the church in creating men. They have to act purposefully in rewarding and fostering the sorts of behaviors that they should want to see in a man. Okay. And largely, that also means, you want men to be decisive. You want them to be leaders. I think most women would agree that. They want men to be wise and stable decision makers who are ready to say no when no needs to be said and ready to say yes when yes needs to be said. That is, they need to prefer a good dance partner in the dance of life, right? So that, and if men are doing their job well, if we're holding up our end, I think that largely, that doesn't solve all problems, but it goes a long way toward it, right? I think if men are acting in a godly and moral and upright way, in a way that is appropriately masculine in the Christian understanding, then this problem does sort itself out. Women actually do prefer that kind of guy. They do want their children, they want their sons to act in that way. So we'll get more buy-in if we do the hard work, I guess. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but women need to be thinking long and hard about this as well. It's not just a male problem. It's not like we can fix it on our own.
Yeah.
Because no cultural problem is ever fixed by just the men or just the women.
Yeah, and I think part of this as fathers I'm not talking for the girls, but for the boys, teaching our boys to be independent, to not be helpless, you should be able to teach your son how to approach a girl in conversation. He shouldn't be texting her if he's interested. Right? Exactly. Yeah. And work ethic, like you said, not being lazy. And parents, oftentimes today, they want to do everything for their kids. And, again, I'm not an old geezer, but growing up, it was unheard of for a boy not to be out cutting his grass. Today, I never see boys cutting grass.
You should come to my house.
So I mean, it's one of those things where teaching work ethic, teaching discipline, teaching that starts at a young age, and it's not impossible when they get to college years, but there's a lot of reprogramming and formation that has to take place.
Yeah. And, with moms in particular, moms of young men, it's okay if they fail.
Yeah.
It's okay if you criticize them.
Yeah.
Right? Moms should feel free to do that. Like, failure should be named when failure happens by mom. She doesn't have to necessarily comfort or excuse failure. And she doesn't even necessarily need to provide a solution to the failure.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because, I'm sorry, most young men want to hear that from dad anyway. They don't usually respond to, unfortunately, to plans and solutions that don't come from another man. That's just kind of the way that guys are wired.
Mm-hmm.
But moms should resist the temptation to coddle or cover over errors, mistakes, and failures, whether or not those are failures of their own children or even of their husband.
Yeah. No, that's great. So, Father Peter, are there any other last comments that you would like to make? I think this has been very helpful. This is one that I will definitely be, not just for everybody to listen to, but especially for younger men, some of our students here. I think this has been very good. Is there anything we didn't touch upon or any of the questions that you would just like to add to this discussion?
No, I guess the very last thing that I would add is just, again, that thing that I said at the beginning, that culture is the work of the making of men and women by men and women, and it has to be necessarily intentional. I think we as a Western culture, fell out of that a long time ago. I think when people think of culture today, they think of this kind of protoplasm out of which the best will necessarily emerge if we just let dialogue and whatnot have its free play. It's like the free market or Silicon Valley. The best technologies are simply going to happen. The best, if we don't mess with anything, all will emerge from the protoplasm, and that will be our culture. We can't make that mistake anymore. Like we have to know what we want to produce as a culture. That is, we have to understand what a Christian man and a Christian woman are, and then we have to try and go out and make it both men and women together, or it's just, it's not going to happen. What we'll get is what we've got, which is a bloody mess.
Yeah. Well, I thought to close us, this was a few weeks ago. I can't remember. I think it was morning prayer. It's David's last instructions to Solomon. Unfortunately, Solomon didn't take heed to this in the long term, but I love the words, and I think it really, just goes so well with everything you've said and the topic we've talked about. This is from 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now the days of David drew near that he should die. And he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn." And I think that really corresponds to what we're talking about from 1 Kings chapter 2. Yeah. So, well, thank you, Father. This has been a treat. This topic. I know we could spend probably 10 episodes talking about this. But what we will do is put in the show notes some of the resources that you mentioned, Leon Podol's, his work, and then also
Helen Andrews.
Yes. Yeah. And some of that, so that people can go and either read, or even in Helen Andrews, the talk that she gave, they can listen to that so that they have a better understanding of what we're talking about here. So.
Yeah, and Helen Andrews is probably the easiest point in. Podol's book is long.
Yeah.
Although, let me mention, too, that I really do think that the Theodore Dalrymple's The Knife Went In is a great read, too. Just about, he calls it, the subtitle of that book is, I think it's something like The Philosophy That Builds the Underclass or something like that.
Oh, okay.
He's talking about cultural decline as well. Include that at your leisure.
I will. Well, thank you, Father. We appreciate it. And
thank you.
Yeah, and look forward to having you on, as we'll be talking a little bit about anxiety and also order and getting into
the settings in.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that is it for this episode. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at podcast@stphillipsblacksburg.org or podcast@anglicanprovince.org, and we will address those questions. Thanks so much. Have a great day.